Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening for the eighth week of the Rugby Research and Injury Prevention Group 2025 Journal Club. We will begin our first Journal Club presentation. Our first intern is Gabriel Moreno from Adelphi University. Gabriel will be presenting on quantifying collision frequency and intensity in rugby. Great, Gabriel, can you please share your screen?
Right, just want to make sure everybody can see my screen. All right, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, RRIPG. As he said, my name is Gabriel Moreno, and today I'm going to be presenting on an article called Quantifying Collision Frequency and Intensity in Rugby Union, so 15s, and Rugby 7s. This is a systematic review, so it compiled a list of, not a list, but 73 articles, and it went over all the data in these articles. So let's begin. So, what is the importance of understanding collision in rugby? Why does it matter? Um, Collisions, they happen in tackles, rucks, mauls, scrums, and they're one of the most frequent activities and the highest risk events in rugby. Tackles cause around an estimated 29 injuries per 1,000 player hours in rugby union 15s. And there's a big performance link between if the team wins more collisions, then they tend to win the matches. So whoever wins these tackles, whoever wins these rucks, these scrums, whoever ends up winning more of these, probably is going to end up winning the match. And these are the big differences now between rugby union 15s and rugby 7s. So union 15s has 15 players on the match, and it's 80-minute games. So it's a long, long game. While rugby 7s, it's a sprint. It's 14 minutes, 7 players, high, intense game. Both of these games involve tackles, rucks, scrums, and mauls. The big difference is the way it's played. Um, to continue on this, the injury risk in Union 15s and in 7s is also different. In 15s, there is an estimated 29 injuries per 1,000 player hours while being tackled, 19 injuries per 1,000 player hours when they're tackling, and 17 injuries per 1,000 player hours doing a ruck and a maul. Now, when we're talking about 7s, it goes up a bit in tackling from 29 to 40.4 injuries per 1,000 player hours. But it is also because keep in mind, rugby 7s tend to have a bit more tackling stuff just because of how fast paced and short the game is. So why should we even measure these collisions? The big reason is because we want to prepare players for match demands. So when I say match demands, this means can the player resist aerobically? Can they hold up to all the impacts that they're going to have? Can they still perform tackle after tackle? And if they can, this also helps reduce injury risk because the players are ready for the games. Um, and now you know what we want to measure collisions, but how exactly do we do this? The way to do this is through video-based analysis, so we could use softwares. The thing is, this is very detailed, but it can be very time intensive and subjective depending on who is actually analyzing these videos. The other option could be through micro technology, which is GPS systems and MEMs. MEMs stand for micro electrical mechanical systems, and these help measure the speed, impact, G-force, and intensity automatically when these players go into these tackles. What you see right here on the right in this picture, that's a device called a catapult. Usually they put it on like this vest, and that tracks the player's speed, how fast you're going, all these things I just listed out. And so the big purpose of this study was to summarize collision frequency and intensity to help optimize player preparation and injury prevention. These are a few examples of the micro technology. The one on the left is not Catapult, it's another brand, and the one on the right is Catapult. As you can see, the things that we could get from these technologies are very similar. So you get the top speed, the amount of impacts. They also have a rating of G-force about how hard these impacts were, and that's how you see the severity of the impacts. So on the right, you can see as well, it says high intensity, so it can measure the distance, how fast your player is going. Depending on where it's located, it can also measure heart rate, contact, the kicks. It ultimately helps to measure the amount of volume these players receive in a game. So volume refers to impact, collision, top speed, distance covered, all of this. Now, what's the research aim, and what are the key questions that this article is looking to answer? So the aim is to synthesize data, so collect all the data on collision frequency and intensity in both rugby union 15s and 7s. and compare the findings between video-based analysis versus microtechnology analysis. Microtechnology is that device such as the catapult or the other ones. A few key questions at the answer here are: how often do these collisions occur in matches and training? How intense are these collisions? This is done through G-force metrics. And what are the difference between fours and backs and Union 15s and 7s? So they differentiate between the results in positions, but also in the different types of rugby codes. And another key question to answer is: how can we use these findings to actually improve the sport, to maybe guide training or periodize how we train the athletes and prevent injuries? How is the study conducted? Very similar to a lot of the systematic reviews, they follow Prisma guidelines. And what that means is they did a search that was conducted across 4 databases. So PubMed, Scopus, Sport Discus, Web of Science. These are like big databases that include a bunch of articles. Their time frame that they allowed was between January 1990 and September 2021. Keep in mind this article came out in 2022. The inclusion criteria was adult rugby players over 18 years, and the studies have to report collision frequency and intensity. They have to report that they're measuring these two things. And they also want to include impacts over AGs are included to exclude running acceleration. So sometimes these devices could measure acceleration. They weren't really looking for that. They were looking more for impact. The data sources. So what this means is, where was the data source from? 37 of these articles were video based, and 24 were micro technology, and there were 12 that included both. The final result was that from 1,143 articles, they came down to 73 studies. So 58 on Union 15s and 15 articles on 7s. This is an example of the Prisma flow sheet that they go through. So sorry, it was 1,014 that they started with. And they removed duplicates and it went down. And after their inclusion criteria, they came up to the 73. This is just a re-explanation of what we just saw. So out of all the participants from all these articles, there was a total of 6,212 players from provincial, national, and international levels. So all the way, anything that was over 18 was included. And the way they divide the results, it was between Union 15, 7s, but they also did, some articles looked at the training focus versus match play. In total, there were 4 studies on training focus, which is very little because not many teams may have the capacity to record and analyze how their trainings are going. So that's why there's so much more on match play focus or articles that looked at the actual games. The following results that I'm going to speak on, they're going to be split between microtechnology and video analysis results for both rugby 15s and 7s. But before we begin, there's an important terminology that I think we should learn before I explain the results. So the first one is, what is collision density? This is used a lot in the results, and it refers to the number of collisions per minute of play, rather than just the total collisions in a match. So for example, rugby 7s, it has fewer total collisions. However, it's shorter than rugby 15s, which may have 156 tackles per match. But since, let's say, 7s matches are only 14 minutes long, the players tend to experience more collisions per minute compared to the rugby 15s players. And another thing that's important to understand is what is defined as very heavy versus severe impacts. So these are categories that are used based on the G-force thresholds that were measured by the microtechnology. So by the catapult sensors that you saw on those vests that the rugby athletes are wearing. A very heavy impact is defined as a collision between 8 to 10 G's of force, and a severe impact is defined as a collision greater than 10 G's of force. And what's a G-force? So G refers to gravitational force. So 1G equals to the force of gravity on Earth, which is 9.81 meters per second squared. And when a collision sensor reads it, so for example, let's say it's 8 G's, it means that the body part or device experiences a force 8 times the force of gravity. In sports, so like in rugby, a higher G-force reflects harder collisions or harder impact, which are linked to greater injury risk, especially when you go to the upper body like the head, neck, shoulder. So now let's look at the actual results. So there was a total of 10 studies that looked at microtechnology and rugby Union 15s. The collision frequency that they measured, since these devices could also measure how many impacts in a certain amount of time, was 0.7 impacts per minute. For forwards, they tended to have 52 very heavy impacts and around 11 severe impacts. For backs, it was 42 heavy impacts and almost 7 severe impacts. And the intensity of these impacts was around usually more than 5 Gs for forwards. It was about 9.1, and for backs, it was about 9.5 per minute. And the collision density, like I said before, they peaked at the first 10 minutes and between 50 to 60 minutes, but it dips mid-game. This could be probably due to fatigue or strategy and trying to win the later match or the later rounds. Now, in regards to studies, there was only 2 studies that looked at microtechnology and training in rugby 15s. The results from these studies was that there were 10.4 tackles and 37.6 contacts in the simulated match session, so in training. And the weekly totals for contacts were higher for forwards versus backs. Now, when we're looking at microtechnology in rugby sevens, it's a lot less studies available. So there's only 8 studies for match play, so actual in-game. And the average for the impacts was around 17 impacts that were over 10 Gs per match. And it ranged from 12.5 to around 21 impacts. For positional analysis, so the actual players on the match, forwards and backs, they show similar relative impact rates. And for collisions, it included impacts, tackles, rucks, and scrums. And some of the studies, they also reported collision frequency by sex, so males versus females. Now, in regards to the results in training, there was only 1 study, which is very, very little. And on average, it was 17.8 tackles per week recorded in training. So it was around 18 tackles in training, which it seems very little, so I'm not sure how accurate that may be. And I just wanted to highlight this because I thought that the way that they showcased the data was pretty interesting. So when we look at these squares, the bigger the square, that means that it's a bigger sample size. So a smaller square like this one, it might not have been such a big sample size. What we're looking at here is the number of absolute. So just think of the number of impacts that were over 10 Gs. So if we look at Clark et al. 2015, we could see that they have one of the matches, it was 15 impacts. So if you look right here, that's going to be this one. So it ranged from 9 impacts to 20 impacts. This is just a pretty nice way that they organize the data for us. Now, when we're looking at video analysis, this is a lot more common because it's a bit more accessible for people to look at videos compared to using Catapult on each player in both teams. So for Rugby 15s, they had a total of 35 studies, and they broke it down in between the contacts in the game. So there was a total of 156, around 156 tackles per match, around 116 rucks per match, and around 22 scrums per match. When we go into be position-specific tackles, forwards, they had around 12 tackles, backs had around 7 tackles, back row forwards had around 16, and inside backs had around 17. There was only 1 study, though, that looked at training that was done by video analysis and rugby 15s. And what they got from this study was that novice players had around 28 tackles during, during small-sided games, and experienced players had around 49 players during small-sided games. 49 tackles during small-sided games. So when they did the video analysis for rugby sevens and match play and training, what they saw was that there was a total of 8 studies that looked at match play, and this study showed that there were 14 tackles per match, 5 rucks per match, and 2 scrums per match. It's a lot less, but keep in mind that rugby sevens is also very short. It's 14 minutes, so the intensity might just be just the same when you compare the ratios of it. And backs and forwards experience more contacts in the second half compared to the first half. This suggests that fatigue and strategy might shift to contribute contact events. So towards the end, they might get a bit more aggressive and not as strategic. And Clark et al., this is pretty interesting. They looked at the collisions between men and women in a single match. There were 51 collisions for men and 44 for women. However, there were no studies looking at training, video analysis for rugby sevens. Moving on, this is how they broke down the information. So what we see right here is A, this was done per type of contact. So A is tackles, B is rucks, and C is scrums per match. For the first one, Hendricks et al., they looked at tackles. So like I said before, the bigger the square, the larger the sample size. So this study had a pretty small sample size. So right here, the information that we could gather from this data is that in match play, there was 36 tackles, according to this study done by Hendricks et al. And then Ray Nikedon, this is two different games that they had in that article, 3.4 tackles and 3 tackles per match. So what are the key patterns and takeaway from all this data? There was a pretty big discrepancy in the data available for training versus match. So there were far fewer studies on training collisions compared to match play, and the training often underrepresents the standard that they might need to be um, able to resist during match. So what this means is that the training might not be doing enough, according to this article, to prepare players for the collision demands that they'll see in the actual game. And between Union 15s and 7s, Union 15 matches had a higher total collisions, so they had around 156, but 7s had a higher collision density, so more tackles per minute. In regards to the method of insight, so how this data was collected, video analysis was pretty good. It was more contextual, but it was very labor intensive. Micro technology was efficient, but every system has a different algorithm, so the reliability and comparability of these results is going to be affected. So for the best results, it would be ideal to combine both for accuracy. The discussion part of this article went over training needs, collision density, and injury prevention. So the current training might not replicate the match collision demands, so they recommended that players are periodized to prepare more for an actual match. For collision density, since 7 players face higher contact frequency, they should have specific tailoring for when they're going to have the 7 seasons compared to when they have the 15 seasons. And in regards to injury prevention, they said it was important to understand collision frequency and intensity so that they could help design safer drills during match practice and better return to play protocols. And they also want to make sure that the players who are collision fit, that when they say collision fit, this just means that the players who could resist the collisions that they're expected to see during these games, these players adapt better and have a lower injury risk. A few limitations that this study had is that the majority of the studies focused on matches versus training. There's only 66 studies on matches compared to only 4 studies for training. There was no video-based training for 7s, and the 7s data is limited. There was only 15 studies out of the total 73. There was only 6 studies on females as well. So there's a big gap in the available data. Another thing is that there was inconsistent metrics. According to the article, each of these 73 articles defined, they had different definitions of collisions and grouping variables. So the way they explained the positions, the way they explained the tackles, it was very different. And it was also hard to compare the algorithms of this micro technology. Another limitation is that they kept saying that the training underrepresents match collision loads. However, if let's say you're playing rugby, right, and you're doing just as many collisions as you do in a game, that might expose you to a bit more contact than necessary, which could increase injury risk, which might not be ideal. So what they recommended was to periodize your training. So let's say as you prepare for a match, or a big game or a big tournament, you're gonna increase your training load. So this might be more tackles, more practice tackles, more collision drills, things like that. But as you get close to the game, you're going to taper down and have a deload week so that you could be ready for when your actual tournament begins. Another limitation is that resources wise. So to have the catapult for each player on the team on during the match and off the match, so during training, is going to have a high cost. And the time demands for analyzing the video of, let's say, the training, the match, and actually going through it and doing it well, it takes a lot of resources. So this might be only realistic for elite or very well-funded teams. It might not be as good for local local club or social teams. So what are some practical applications and next steps? So there's a space right now in the research to improve collision research. So the same way there was a consensus statement for video analysis, there should be a consensus statement for the MEMs to help standardize the metrics that these wearables collect. And the next thing would be to address inconsistency in collision intensity definitions. So you see how some of them were severe or heavy. Having a standard for those when you're analyzing the data that we get from these wearables. Now, in regards to integration of methods, there should be a standard as well for how to analyze video and microtechnology together. And to get the best results, it's ideal to do both. And for future research goals, there should be an increase in rugby 7s and female rugby players. And it'd be very interesting to investigate the best practices for collision load periodization. So the same way we periodize strength training and Conditioning, maybe part of that load should include the amount of impacts that these players receive both in game and in training. This is the references. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for that excellent presentation, Gabriel. Does anyone have any questions, or Dr. Lopez, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, thanks so much, Gabriel. I think you did a great job analyzing the manuscript. There's a great study that they pulled together. The data. What's unique, I'm glad you brought it up at the end, the limitations, consistent variables, the problem and definitions of everyone's view of collisions or impacts. Um, you know, um, a consensus statement would be beneficial for the sport overall, um, due to the fact of many codes that are played, and it would be just a big impact in that aspect. Obviously, rugby sevens needs to be analyzed further as well. Thank you.
If no one else has any questions, we can move on to the second intern. Our second intern is William McIntyre from Howard University. William will be presenting on neck strengthening in elite rugby union players. William, can you please share your screen?
Can everybody see my screen? Okay. Thank you, Rivet, for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. My name is Wayne McIntyre. I'm a senior at Howard University studying sports medicine. And today I'll be talking about the implementation of a neck strengthening exercise program in Elite Rugby Union, a team case study over one season. This study was done in 2022. So a little background about the study. The study was done in the sport of rugby, and knowing rugby is a high contact sport with a lot of frequent collisions from tackles, scrums, and rucks. And a lot of the players, especially the forwards, are at an elevated risk for cervical spine injuries and sports-related concussions, also known as SRCs. And also another type of injury that's very common in rugby are head and neck injuries, and these are mainly concussions, and they're the most common injury in the sport of elite rugby. This was taken from 2011 to 2019. And up to 20 concussions per 1,000 match hours was the incidence rate for professional players. And also, low neck injuries and lower neck strength is associated with a greater risk of sports-related concussions. And the research gap is very big. Despite the evidence, neck strengthening is underused in rugby programs. It's really underused in a lot of sports around the world. And the few studies that were evaluated was the long-term implementation of neck strengthening programs and also the feasibility in elite team settings. So the purpose of the study was to really just assess the effectiveness of a structured phase neck strengthening program on maximal isometric neck strength and the incidence rate of the head and neck injuries in relation to sports-related concussions. So the study will be done on different parts of the neck and different rotations and different, so you could test like different strength of the different parts of the neck. And also to determine the accessibility and feasibility of implementing such a program in a professional rugby setting. So these are the methods that were done from the study. So the study took 39 male players from one professional rugby team in Australia, and they took 26 forwards and 13 players from the back group, I guess it's defense. And the outcome that were measured were the neck strength. So that was measured in kilograms. I was using the dynamometer, and what that is basically just it's a measurement tool that's used to calculate strength and calculate force applied and created from a player's like moving their neck back and forth. And the injury incidence was tracked per 1,000 player hours, and the accessibility and feasibility that was evaluated through 3 surveys across the season. That was done from the players and from the staff. The study design, it was a pre-post intervention study, so that means it's team-based and it's a case study. And the data that was collected was from the 2020 Super Rugby season in Australia, and the comparison was from the injury data from 2019 versus the 2020 injury data. And then the intervention was phased, meaning it was tailored to just to neck strengthening programs using head harnesses, resistant cords, and the body weight isometric exercises, especially during the COVID-19 breakdown. Since the study was done in 2022, the study was highly affected by the COVID vaccine or the coronavirus, and we'll see in the limitations how that affects the study. So this is how the actual exercise is actually done. So how it was done is a tool was measured, like I said before, the dynamometer, and also a head harness was used to like measure the player's neck strength. So the measures that were taken was the neck flexors, neck flexor is when you move your head forward, neck extender is when you move your head backwards, and then left and right lateral flexors are when you move your head or your neck left and right. The key metric that was found was the FE ratio, which is flexor over extensor ratio. This was used to evaluate the muscular balance between from the neck. In the individualized training prescription, this was each player's 1 rep max for each muscle group that was estimated. So whatever the player's highest strength that was calculated from this test that was used for the player's data. That's the data that was collected. And the training load set as a percentage of the 1 rep max was also adjusted per training phase. And exercise goals was to really just raise or maintain the FE ratio as long as it wasn't over zero point 0.6. And this was to achieve a balance between the left flexor muscle and the right flexor muscle. And this is also to target weaker muscle groups, especially the flexors. So the discussions from the study was really just to target the flexor training significantly and also to improve isometric neck strength in professional rugby players. And also the injury training suggests there's a potential for fewer concussions and the head and neck injuries which were better neck conditioning, especially when the flexor of over extensor ratio was less than 0.6 as I mentioned before. And 4 players who had extensor dominant profiles benefited the most from the flexor specific intervention. So these are the results. These are just the results from the players that was done in the study. So the study looked at the player's age, weight, neck girth, height, and also the players reported previous head or neck injuries from sports-related concussions. And also the players reported previous sports-related concussions as well. So as you can see, the data was divided between the forward group and the back group. As you can see, the median age of the forward group was a little bit higher than the age from the back group. Whereas the height is relatively the same, and also the weight too, as you can see, is a little bit greater than the forward group than the back group. I believe it's just because forward players are rely on more strength, they need more muscle mass, lords like to go forward and move forward, and yeah. And then as you can see from the data, you can see that the sports-related concussion is also a little greater on the forward group than the back group. So these are the results continued. In this table, this shows like the forward and back groups isometric neck strength, and this is changes from across the 2020 rugby season. So the data is separated again between the forward group and the back group. The forward group having 26 players and the back group having 13 players. And so as you can see, this is the main baseline neck strength. So this is what they started out with. So the flexors started out with 32, the extensors 56, and as you can see, it's a gradual increase. So from the forwards, there's a gradual increase from 32 to 43, 56 to 60. Then the right left flexor, which was started at 43, went to 49. As you can see, it's a gradual increase from all the flexor muscles from the neck. And then also, as you see in the back group started out with 30.05, 42, 36, and 35. As you can see, it's a little bit less, as we stated before, as 4 groups tend to have more, start out with more strength than the back groups. This can be due to their weight, as we mentioned before, just because it started out with a higher weight. And then so, as you see, it's a greater increase. So it started out with 30, went to 32 for the flexors, and the extensors started with 42, went to 44. The right left flexor, which started out 36 to 37, and then 35 to 37 on the left flexor. So as you can see, it's a little bit of an increase, not as much as the 4 groups. And yeah, so this table 3, this table talked about the head and neck injury rates, and it includes sports-related concussions. This is a club statistic from 2019 from 2020. As you can see, all the players in head and neck injuries with sports-related concussions had only 13, and whereas the forward group made up for that for 8 of them, and the back group made up 5 for that. And the incidence rate, as calculated here, as you can see, per 1,000 play hours is 2.7, and then the forward group is 1.79, and then the back group is 1.12. This is from 2019. The 2020 study, well, 2020 data collection, it took 5 players in total, 3 being forwards and 2 being from the back group. And the incidence rate for the 2020 study was 2.39. And then from the forwards, it made up 1.47 of that number. And then the back group made up 1.01. So this results continued. So the forward group which saw we was more significant improvement in flexor muscles. It had an increase of 35%, and left lateral flexors was 17.37% with a p-value of 0.04, and the flexor extensor ratio had an increase of 25.86 with a p-value less than 0.001. That's for the forward group. And for the back group, it was a significant improvement also, not as big as the forward group, but it saw improvement of 9.29 and with a p-value of 0.01. As you can see, the extensor muscles changes were not as significant. This is largely because less than 50% of the players were not prescribed extensor exercises. So they only prescribed flexor exercises, not extensor exercises. The injury data. So the injury data from the reduction saw that the head and neck injuries saw an incidence rate ratio of 0.86, and the sports-related concussion saw an incidence rate of 0.63. However, the confidence intervals were wide. So whenever it's a wide confidence interval, that means the results are not inconclusive. So that means the data was not done properly. But I'm gonna get into that why that was and the limitations. So the ratio correlation was from all the players who suffered a head and neck injury between 2020 had a baseline flexor extension ratio of 0.6. And from that significant inverse correlation between the flexor extension ratio and the history of sports-related concussions or injury rate of less than 0.35. And from the survey, the players, 80% of the players agreed exercises were worthwhile, easy to complete, and should continue. So they believe that they saw improvement in play from the doing the neck exercises, even though some of them got injured and got concussions. And the staff, 75 to 100% of them agreed that the program was beneficial and easy to supervise and also valuable for the club. So they wanted to adopt the program so they could do it for future usage. And also the high compliance rate even during COVID-19 lockdown. So even though they were using masks, I'm guessing during the COVID coronavirus and the just getting vaccinated too, that also affects how the study was being done. So here's some limitations. So with the sample size of being only 39 players in a single club in a single season, at that in a single year, it limits the generalizability. So with a small data pool, you really can't pull as much data as you want. So the study only could have a range from 1 to 39, if that makes sense. So I feel like if it was the higher range, a higher number of players, the study will be done more effectively. And also non-randomized design. So lack of control group reduces the ability to attribute changes solely into the intervention. And also the COVID-19 interruption. So with the COVID-19 introduction into the season, it saw a reduced match time, training time, and may have influenced injury rates and compliance. Also, the statistically uncertainty. So with the wide confidence interval, like I said before, in the injury rates, this also reduces the confidence interval reduces the confidence in injury reduction claims. And also the extensor under training. Over half the players didn't train the extensor, limiting full muscle group analysis. So with the players only training their flexors and their left and right of flexors, this literally limits how much data could be collected from the back group, as we saw in the data. So to conclude, neck strength can be improved using sport-specific exercises in elite rugby players. The neck strengthening program was highly accepted by players and staff, and while the program was feasible to integrate into existing club training routines, only players saw neck and extensor ratios less than 0.6 were likely to sustain an injury. Use some references. And thank you. Are there any questions?
Thank you for that excellent presentation, William. Does anyone have any questions, or Dr. Lopez, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Willie, thank you so much for the presentation. I think you did a good job. I think um, more work needs to be done in this area, obviously on evaluation. They've had maybe a couple of papers that definitely have stated that there is improvement, but I think this study over one season, it was inconclusive, obviously. I think you agree that more or longer window of time evaluating players is really the standard to evaluate whether there's significance in the outcomes. And that's really, I think, the limitation of this paper is just a small cohort in the one season.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, if no one else has any questions, we can move on to the third intern. Our third intern is Nadira Peaks from Adelphi University. Nadira will be presenting on do rugby players underreport concussion symptoms? Nadira, can you please share your screen?
Yes. Can everyone see my screen? Okay. Thank you. Okay, so as Rafik said, my name is Nadira Peaks, and today I will be presenting on do rugby league players underreport concussion symptoms? This was a cross-sectional study of elite teams based in Australia. So a bit of background. In many contact sports, such as rugby, there is suspicion of underreporting concussions and its symptoms by athletes. The National Rugby League, or NRL, competition recorded 102 concussions in games during the 2019 season, equating to 14.7 per 1,000 playing hours. The research surrounding symptom reporting bias and the reluctance of players to report concussion symptoms is scarce. There's currently no research available to determine the rates of underreporting of concussion symptoms in rugby league in Australia or overseas. So what this study aimed to do was to determine the rates of underreporting in elite rugby league, explore the reasons why players may or may not report symptoms or suspected concussions, expose the current flaws in concussion diagnosis based on subjective symptom reporting, and direct future player education based on the reasons for underreporting. So we're going to get into the methods that were used during the study. The National Rugby League is an Australian and New Zealand professional rugby league competition. There are 16 professional teams with 36 contracted senior men players, as well as variable numbers of players aged under 20 years. Players from 3 of the National Rugby League clubs were selected to participate in a voluntary anonymous survey on player behavior surrounding concussion reporting and reasons for underreporting over the 2018 and 2019 Australian Rugby League seasons. In order to reduce reporting bias, the surveys were distributed during the 2020 preseason and collected by the club representative, who was instructed not to review the answers or identify players. An anonymous survey was used to allow players to report instances of underreporting without fear of being sidelined. And the study examined unreported concussions, inaccuracies in symptom reporting during assessments, and the reasons why players might underreport symptoms. So to the right, we have an example of the survey. So for example, one question says, number of diagnosed concussions by a doctor in the past 2 seasons, game or training. One answer would be none, it'd be 1 to 2, 3 to 5, and 5 or more. And the rest are examples of the survey. So, for the results regarding patient demographics. Across 3 National Rugby League clubs, there were a total of 151 player responses. 39.1% identified as first grade players, 21.2% identified as reserve grade players, 39.7% identified as under 20 years old players. This equates to a response rate of 84.3%, inclusive to both players who identify as National Rugby League or reserve grade players. And a table was built to outline the demographics of the survey group, including age range, years played in the elite competitions, and exposure to concussion education. And here we have a table of the percentage of participants in the subsection, along with age range, years of playing experience in elite competition, and exposure to concussion education reported by the elite rugby league participants in Australia. So this 22% over here means that there were 22% players who were in the age range of 23 to 25. And as for the reserve grade, there were 25% players who were age ranged from 23 to 25. The National Rugby League group were more experienced in regard to years played in elite competitions and had better reported exposure to concussion education. Now, for the results regarding concussion reporting statistics, this table is going to outline the reporting behavior of the participants. So, for example, in the National Rugby League, 67.2% of players were diagnosed with concussion in the past 2 years. And for the reserve grade, 62.5% of players were diagnosed with concussion in the past 2 years. While the U20s players, there were 40.7% of them who were diagnosed with concussion in the past 2 years. So to discuss regarding the rates of underreporting, the diagnosis of a concussion remains dependent on player-reported symptoms. The combination with visualized signs and basic cognitive assessments in comparisons with baselines. An encouraging finding in the current study is perceived reduction of underreporting when compared with similar studies done across other sports. And this may be due to growing media coverage of concussions, which has increased awareness of the long-term consequences and helped reduce the stigma around reporting them. As for the reasons for underreporting, the majority of reasons for underreporting in this study were related to either not wanting to be ruled out of the game or training, or not wanting to let down coaches or the team. It appears that players in the higher grade of the National Rugby League have a greater tendency to not report concussion symptoms compared with under 20 years of aged players. This was a 22% or 13% difference. The authors consider this likely related to the greater pressures on the higher grade players from coaches, teammates, and the public. So a few limitations for this study. Due to reporting bias, it is difficult to determine the accuracy of this study. The authors did not analyze the survey for reliability, which opens the door for internal inconsistencies. And the study reached out to the national rugby clubs and received great response rates. However, a survey that is complete by all 16 clubs will be necessary to get a more accurate idea of reporting rates in the National Rugby League. Essentially, the sample size of the study was too small. Here are the conclusions. 17.2% of elite rugby league players in Australia chose not to report concussion-related symptoms during the 2018 and 2019 seasons. Further research is needed to refine concussion detection and prevention strategies in contact sports, and the reasons for underreporting can definitely help direct future education for players across elite competitions. These are my references. Thank you for listening. Are there any questions that I can answer?
Thank you for that great presentation, Nadira. Does anyone have any questions, or Dr. Lopez, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, if we close that out, Nadira, that'd be great. So I think this is a problem not only just in Australia, but in other countries and other sports as well. The players' culture that want to continue playing. It's important to understand that if we can get to an understanding where athletes are not afraid of, or maybe even providing a mechanism anonymously where they could report things is really the way to go, because I think players are afraid of performing, and if they don't perform, they feel that they're not an athlete. So it's a combination of them being performers, but also by them being afraid of the consequences, maybe being pulled. There's a lot of players that need to be enlightened, and maybe you did dabble into it and allude to the fact that awareness is an important aspect. But again, I think there's a bigger picture that needs to be addressed with athletes and those who receive concussions are afraid to disclose them. There's definitely a stigma that needs to be, eradicated from the culture. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. There seems to be a psychological factor within this.
Okay, if there's no more questions, that will conclude week 8 of the Rugby Research and Injury Prevention Group Journal Club. Thank you all for attending.